verge, and genetically of sight, sound, taste, or even mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Next stop, Jake Stief. Hi, I'm Jakey Stief, but you could call me white bread, long-haired freaky person, doesn't really matter. I haven't made a book review in a while, or an actual video for that matter, so I am sorry about that. So today I'm going to make it up to you by reviewing a fun book called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Adam Douglas. Now this was published in 1979, and it's one book in a series of 5. There's a 6th one, but that was published in 2009 by a completely different person. Anyhow, this book is hilarious as far as comedy goes in a book. It even made me LOL at some points. That was funny. You could say it induces bouts of almost uncontrollable hearty laughter. Now this book is also a science fiction and on the verge of an adventure. While I have not read the other books in the series yet, there is a good plot developing. Now for my warning. Going ahead any further in this video may potentially ruin your reading experience. While I keep spoilers to a bare minimum, I review what I must in order to make you interested in this great book enough to read it. The protagonist, main character, good guy, for those of you with a small vocabulary, is a guy named Arthur Dent. And he does a good job of making you laugh with his whiny rants. His house is getting ready to be demolished by the city, so he wallows in the mud in front of a few bulldozers that are getting ready to knock it down. There is a much larger issue at hand, however. Much larger home is getting ready to be destroyed. I'll let you find this out, as it may be a shock to some people. A friend named Ford Prefect makes him aware of this issue. Aliens were getting ready to destroy this much larger home, but his friend, who also turns out to be an alien, zaps them both onto the alien spacecraft. This breed of alien turns out to be a Vogon, a nasty slug-like creature. Let me stop there. So let me say that most of the plot is structured off of an entire bundle full of coincidences. Substantial coincidences. But that is what makes it funny, and it also adds some surprising twists. For instance, at one point in the book, Ford and Arthur are saved from almost certain death with the odds of 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against, which also just so happens to be the phone number of one of Arthur's former crushes, which also leads to another coincidence, and another one, and another one, which also develops the plot. Never read a science fiction book which incorporated humor, and I thoroughly liked it. Now, if science fiction isn't your thing, then some components may be slightly less funny, but it will still make for an entertaining book. Now, this book was very easy to read, only took 6 hours, but don't let that deter you. Sure, sometimes a 1,500-page epic like The Count of Monte Cristo makes for a better novel. I personally think so. But sometimes a simpler one can tell a good story, especially when it incorporates humor. That leads me to say that while reading this, I didn't feel like the author was trying to lure me in with humor. Humor was a part of the book. I mean, if the characters weren't comical, then I wouldn't have read it. If the book didn't include a highly depressed robot that is so dull it makes other computers commit suicide, or a spontaneously appearing sperm whale hundreds of miles above a fantasized planet wondering if the ground will be its friend, then I just wouldn't have liked this book. This book is not like other science fiction space travel novels. It's completely original. You'll never find another one like that. If anything, some books afterwards have stolen a few concepts. Nothing before. Finally, this book was written in the 80s, late 70s, so the narrator makes a big hype about some of the technology. One of these, for example, is an electronical handheld device with a 4-inch by 4-inch screen. Gasp! That holds millions of pages. OMG! For an encyclopedia called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I find very amusing. It's also the title of the book, for those of you who just can't seem to make connections, which leads me to wonder why you're reading a book at this level. Maybe you should still read Cat in the Hat. So please, please, read this book. You probably need to in high school anyway, or so I'm told. But what are the odds of someone my age or younger actually watching a book review on YouTube? I know no one who is as old as me that enjoys reading, or is at least brave enough to admit it in this cruel, cruel world. I leave you now by reading the first chapter or two of this book. But first, always know where your towel is. It has more uses than you think. Okay. So just forward. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all make a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. Remember this is important later in the book. It took me a while to make the connection, a little while after I actually finished the book, to realize that the first chapter was important. Anyhow, this is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe of some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had never heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it also has a highly successful one. More popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Olon Colifid's trilogy in philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? In many more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least widely inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are incredibly intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house. Chapter 1. I guess that was sort of like the preface. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of west country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror pointing at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put on his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped onto the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great length. He rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he had just found about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out. He decided no one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something connected with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Well, that's it. That's all I'm going to read you. Thank you for watching, and so long, and thanks for all the fish.